50% of all endgames in chess are rook endings. In this video, I'm going to show you 3 rook endings which you absolutely must know. If you know all these rook endings, you can solve any endgame position which involves rooks, of course. You can solve any rook ending, and it may take you some time, but you can also learn the more complicated rook endings as well. These are the 3 most basic rook endgames. Let's start with the Philidor position. Now this is the Philidor position. White has an extra pawn and is trying to promote it. Here black has a very simple defensive resource which if you don't know, you'll probably lose this game. How do you defend this position with black? Well, the method is simple. First of all, you have to place your king in front of the square where the pawn is going to queen. In this case, that's the d8 square, in front or on the square where the pawn is about to queen. Now technically, if the king is here or here, c8 or e8, where it controls the queening square, even then the Philidor technique will work. However, ideally you want the king standing right in front of the pawn. The next step that you need with black is to create a 3rd rank defense, or in this case a 6th rank defense. How do you do that? You play your rook to h6. What does this do? It cuts off the king from moving further. Now if white tries to just wait around with rook b7, you just play rook a6. So you just don't allow the white king to move ahead. If the white king moves ahead, suddenly the game is winning for white. Finally, when white will realize that, okay, I can't just keep moving rook, right? I have to push the pawn. I need to make progress. Whenever you do push this pawn, we just play rook back to h1. This is the most important move. Now we are going to deliver checks from behind the white king, and now there is no way for the white king to run away from these checks. By the way, if rook a8, we just play king d7. We are not worried about this. If white tries to push his pawn, check, king moves, check, king moves, check, king moves, and there is no way to escape the checks. If you try and come towards the rook, well then guess what? Your pawn is on d7 is hanging. So instead of pushing the pawn, white may try to go king e6, but it doesn't matter. You still just keep delivering check after check after check after check after check, and in the end white will realize that there is no way for him to win this position and he will accept a draw offer. So that's the Philidor position. Now what happens if you get it in a real game? In the real game, you probably won't get a Philidor position like that. You'll probably get something like this. Just remember the key points. King in front of the pawn, your king is already here, and rook on the 3rd rank or the 6th rank, creating a blockade. What do? White cuts off our king. We just create this blockade, and now we just wait. We wait for the pawn and the king to come towards us while keeping our 3rd rank blockade, and by the time white is ready to push his pawn, we go all the way back, and now we deliver the checks from behind. So that is the Philidor position. Now the next position, which is also just as important, is the Lucena position. This is the Lucena position. This is how white is going to win this position. Now, first of all, white has done all the hard work and has pushed his pawn all the way here. He's got his king right in front of the pawn. This is the Lucena position. How do you win this? Well, to win this position, you first need to create a distance of 2 files between the black king and your pawn. And your pawn, this one here on f7, a distance of 2 files. This is very, very, very important. How do you create a distance of 2 files? You deliver a check. Once you play rook d2 check, the king has to move to c7. What if the king moves to e6 and tries to attack your pawn? Well, you don't have to worry about it. You can just play king e8 and threaten that you're going to just push your pawn and queen it. What can black do? Can he try and take the pawn? Of course not. Rook e2 check, king f6, rook f2, and guess what? You're going to pick up this rook next, and black will be losing in this rook endgame. Which is why after rook d2 check, black should move his king. Once he moves the king, now we need to do step 2 of the Lucena position, which is to create a bridge. How do we do that? Which is the 4th rank? This is our 4th rank. We go ahead and put the rook on the 4th rank. Why is this so vital? Let's say you try and move the king and push the pawn and queen it. Guess what happens? Check. You move the king again. Check. You move the king again. Check. You move the king again. He keeps checking you. But if you could block this check with your rook, then all of a sudden you are winning. Which is why in this position you have to play rook d4. And now black has nothing to do. He can play king c6, but his king is cut off, or he could just wait with the rook as well. And now you can just move your king like this. And here on f6, rook f1 check, king g6, rook g1 check, king f5. Note that if you don't keep checking white, you're going to queen on the next move. And now rook f1 check, you have rook f4. Now why did I tell you that you need to create a distance of 2 files? Imagine that the black king was on d7 instead. Yeah, just a distance of 1 file. After the trade of rooks, if the black king was on d7, he could just play king e7 and pick up the f7 pawn. However, since we already separated the king by 2 files from our pawn, whatever you play, king d7, we just queen and it's game over. So this is the Lucena position. Now the next endgame is very interesting. Here you might be thinking, well, this is our Lucena position. This is winning for white. But actually, it is not winning for white. It's a draw. Why is this a draw? Because black has rook a8 check, and this is the concept of the long side. So whenever you have a pawn on any rank, on any file, any rank, it divides the board into 2 sides, the long side and the short side. Here, the right side, or the one where the king side is the shorter side because you have only 3 squares here. However, the long side is the one on the queen side because you have 4 squares here. Now the defensive technique is that you need to put your king on the short side and your rook on the long side, because if your rook is on the long side and on the extreme corner file, then guess what? You move the king, check you again. If you come here, I pick up your pawn. Again, you do this, check. You keep moving this, check. There is no way for you to make progress in this position, which is why even this position is a draw. Now if you made it this far into the video, I have a bonus position for you. You might look at this position and say that this is going to be a Philidor position. We need to put our rook on the 3rd rank, cut it off, and guess what? It's an easy draw. But what's the problem here? We don't have access to the 3rd rank, or the 6th rank in this case, because the pawn is covering that square. And now, how do you defend this? Well, don't panic. This is a knight's pawn. The pawn is on the knight's file, and this is a huge advantage to black because that means that black does not need a Philidor position. Instead, he can just play rook c8. And the reason this works is it's called passive defense. The pawn can be pushed all the way to the top of the board, but there is no way for it to queen. All we are going to do is move our rook from side to side to side. So let's say king a6, just move the rook. b6, just move the rook. If you go rook a7 check, just move the rook. Rook b7 check, king a8, rook g7, king b8. There are no problems here. And instead of moving the rook, if you try to push the pawn, again, just move the rook. And surprisingly, there is absolutely no way for white to win. So if you watched all of this, that means you enjoyed the video, and there is definitely a reason to subscribe to this channel, like the video, and stay tuned for more chess.